Okay, welcome back. This is Peeling Syd Barrett, episode 6. And in this episode, I would like to cover a very heavy topic and Mr. Roger Syd Barrett's most well known song, I suspect, which is See Emily Play. And most people hear this song, and it's a very lively song, and this is their favorite. You could argue that it's his best or whatever, but I will state as kind of a precursor to the rest of the episode that for me, this episode represents a form of revelation, considering Syd Barrett's use of poetry and literature, historical literature, and then incorporating those into a song as a complete work of art. Now, previously we discussed some use of symbolism and some use of language and other things, but this shows, as was outlined in the very first introduction that I provided, Untangling the Octopus, that Syd Barrett is going through and using traditional literature and weaving it into his songs, possibly. Correct? So we never really know exactly what the influences are to someone. You can draw correlations and have suspicions, but you never really know for sure unless they give you that information and say, yes, I specifically chose that because of this reason. And since we don't have anything like that from Mr. Barrett, we have to kind of go through and kind of pull on strings and try to find any kind of clues that we can find as to what exactly he was thinking. So to start off the episode, the first things that I would like to talk about are mistakes again that are in previous episodes, or things that I just left out that I intended to include. The first thing that I'd like to include is a discussion of the Boy and the Lion episode, when I talked about the color of the shirt that the person is wearing in the painting that's walking into the dark doorway, which could be a representation of death. If you notice, the entire family is wearing green. You can go back and watch that episode if you like, if you haven't seen it already. The entire family is wearing green, and green, of course, is often used as a color of vegetation, growth, and fertility. So it basically represents things that are alive. If someone is trying to speak symbolically, there's no way of knowing that for sure, but that's pretty common in the art world for people to be speaking symbolically, or even subconsciously, and they don't really realize what they're saying. In that case, then blue is a very cold color and can represent the coldness of death, which also makes sense. The other thing that I'd like to discuss is the crossed arch in the background, which we mentioned could be a cross. And I'd just like to point out that the shape of it is very subtle. And again, I mean, we're making assumptions. This is a possibility. But the shape of it is perhaps exaggerated as a bend to disguise the nature of the cross, or to even suggest a form of twisting of someone's ideas on what that cross might represent. Just going out there, it's a possibility. Again, no way of knowing something like that, but it is something that someone could be subconsciously representing or consciously representing. Now, that's one thing. The second thing is, I mentioned Max Barrett, who's Syd Barrett's father, had an entire wing of a hospital, I believe, that was given his name in retrospect, I guess, or in honor to his father. And I'd like to correct that and say that apparently it was just a room. And I'm not sure the name of the hospital. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say that I'm going to throw that into the episode in writing when I actually release the episode. So that'll be included at that time. So that's all the corrections I really wanted to make, or add-ins that I wanted to make. Let's get into this episode, and it's going to be big. It might be long, so I don't want to waste too much time. The first thing I want you to do is I'm going to give you two videos. One is the one released by Pink Floyd. I believe it's HD Pink Floyd. If not, I'll correct it when I go through and I add in the editing and the writing in the video. And I'll include that in the description. And that's the one that's in black and white. It's the video that was released and was shot. And if you notice, it has David Gilmour in there. There's no Syd Barrett. And they're just kind of dancing around and doing things. So I'm going to include that. I'll also include a video that has the lyrics, so that if you're not familiar with the lyrics, you can look at that, or you can just look them up on the internet real quick and kind of make notes. So I'd like you to watch the video, take notes on the lyrics themselves, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss kind of what I see when I look at it, and you can see if that kind of matches up with what you see. All right, about 6 minutes in. I'm going to put a break in here and then come back and we'll discuss. Okay, so let's discuss a few things about the videos. The first one is the video itself that the band shot. And one of the things I noticed is that it's kind of goofy. It doesn't have a lot of the subtle kind of crumbs of genius, let's call it, that are in a video like Arnold Layne. And the major change, of course, is that Mr. Barrett's not really participating at this point in time. He was still with the band when they shot this, I believe. But he's not in this video, and he's not really doing as much work with the band at this time. Now, I should also point out that this song was actually recorded later than Piper at the Gates of Dawn. But it was released before that album, and you could say that it's probably to kind of use the catchiness, the pop catchiness of the song to help push the album, which makes sense financially, right? We should also mention that that Pink Floyd had signed with EMI prior to this. They signed after Arnold Layne, and that song, Arnold Layne, was produced by Joe Boyd. And I'm not sure who produced CM. I believe Norman Smith produced See Emily Play. Norman Smith, of course, is famous for working with the Beatles, and he was a real pro, considered by the industry to be a real pro at producing. And there are interviews with him discussing working with Syd Barrett and some other things. And it's kind of funny to listen to him talk, because the Beatles considered him to be a really easy guy to work with, but apparently he didn't get along with Syd Barrett at all, and Syd Barrett didn't get along with him at all either. And perhaps by investigating this song, we can kind of find out why. Because later on, apparently Syd really disliked playing this song. And that doesn't really make sense to people that create things. Because when you create something, there are things that may or may not really come out the way you want. But it's very difficult to look at something that you've created and say that you hate it, or that you don't want to be associated with it anymore, or be willing to play it or show it. So there's something kind of going on there. At any rate, let's discuss the video. One thing is they're kind of goofy. There's a little bit of uneasiness going on. There's not a whole lot of crumbs of genius in there. And by that I mean, in my experience, when I'm dealing with someone that I would consider to be a form of a genius, they have a tendency to just kind of casually throw out these little extremely interesting things, and they don't even seem to realize that they're doing it often. And you'll kind of hear them say or see something or do something that is completely innovative, and they're doing these things so often that a lot of times they're just kind of throwing them away, almost like the Beatles would throw away songs that they didn't like that were pretty good songs. And I don't see any of that in this video. It's kind of a goofy video. So they're just kind of dancing around in a park or of some kind. It's funny to me that Nick Mason is kind of playing on an invisible drum set, because at one point in time they kind of told him not to play the drums. They were recording a song, and I can't remember what the song was, but he couldn't really get the drum portion, and so I don't know if it was Norman Smith that played it or someone else, studio musician maybe, but they played the drum part for that song instead of him. And I don't know, it's just kind of funny that he's playing on invisible drums. Of course, they're all playing invisible instruments, although Roger Waters has his guitar. I don't know what he's doing with it. And then they all get together and they dance kind of around a maypole, which is in line with the actual lyrics and content of the music. So those are that's my feel kind of for the video. And all in all, there's not much there, in my opinion. And it's kind of a letdown because this is a pretty deep song. So, which is an indicator to me also that perhaps they didn't understand the depth of this song. Okay, now let's go ahead and get into some of the lyrics of the song. And we'll see what your thoughts are. And we'll kind of run through what my thoughts are. And you see if we kind of come to some reasonable conclusions about what the song might represent. Okay? So first off, we realize right away that the song's about someone named Emily. And there was a young, honorable Emily that was associated somewhat with that scene, the UFO and subculture scene, and I believe she was part of the free school that went on. And I think her name might have been Emily Young. I don't know if I'll include that in the video or not. I don't know if it really matters because I don't believe that Syd would have actually used someone's name. He's obviously not, he doesn't do that in any of his other songs. So this is one song where people say, oh, they know who Emily is, but I'm not inclined to agree with that, personally. You can believe that if you like, but I don't personally believe that. So let's run through some of the lyrics. Emily's making an attempt to kind of understand something, but she can't. And so she's borrowing other people's ideas. And then she loses her mind. And then there's a reference to the games of May. Now this song was supposedly written for Games of May. We don't know when a song is written in complete form, and we don't know when it was begun to be written. Mr. Barrett he had a collection of songs already and ideas. So this song, like a song like Bike or Effervescing Elephant, could have been started a long, long time ago. There's a long time before they released it. There's no way of knowing how long someone's turning ideas over in their head before they really record and release. We have a record and we have a release date. Other than that, it's very difficult to know when someone starts turning things around in their head. At any rate, the Games of May is a reference to May 1st, which is in Gaelic tradition, Beltane. And that is simply, simply put, it's a festival of fertility during May. They've come up with all other ideas for representing kind of a socialist holiday, which is May Day, May 1st. But there is a much older tradition of Beltane. And I guess you could argue that the pink, if you follow the political possibility of pink being a representation of a commie guy or a commie band, and they're doing May Day stuff, then you're free to make that association. For me, that's a very simple association to make, and I don't know necessarily that I believe that Syd was of that mindset. Okay, so back to the lyrics. Emily cries after dark, and then she's looking through trees, and she's covered with sadness, and then she's going to lose her mind. The most beautiful lines of the song are when Syd rhymes gown with ground, which is very important. I'm going to make that a word association. And then floating on a river, and he rhymes river with ever and forever. So those two lines to me are absolutely beautiful. And that's not something that someone would normally rhyme with because they're not specifically rhyme related, standard rhyme. But they do fit together extremely well. And then he goes back to the chorus, Games of May and See Emily Play. So, like we said, There are stories about who Emily is, who Emily could represent. It's a very literal interpretation of the song. Perhaps there's some kind of relation between Emily Young and Mr. Barrett. There's no way of knowing something like that. And I'm not inclined to believe that. That's one interpretation. Okay? So, to me, there are two other possibilities. And perhaps they are related. Perhaps all three are related. Perhaps Syd was simply using the name Emily because he recognized that it could represent more than just Emily. All right? Now, the first possibility is related to, let's go back through this and read it backwards. Okay? Let's read these lyrics backwards and forget Emily. Just get that name out of your head and let's work backwards. First off, we get to the chorus, which is lose your mind and play in the games of May. And then we get to the gown and the ground and floating on a river. Losing your mind, looking through trees in sadness, and Emily's crying, and she's borrowing other people's ideas. All right. So when I do that, and I remove the possibility of Emily, and I have those specific characteristics, they remind me immediately of someone. And if you are into literature at all, I think you would agree that it is very likely, or very possibly, a reference to Ophelia from the story Hamlet. And I am quite certain that Mr. Barrett would have been familiar with Ophelia from Hamlet. Most English students, I think, are, especially middle-class English students. In England, Hamlet is arguably Shakespeare's most famous play. I'm sure it's covered in standard education, so I think he would have read it. And as we'll find out later, there are reasons why he may have felt a kinship to this story. Okay? So the first thing, and I'm going to read Hamlet backwards to make the connection to Ophelia. Okay? So it fits with kind of what we've already discussed. Now, at the end of the play, and this is Act 4, Scene 7, I believe, the Queen enters, and the Queen is Hamlet's mother. And she's speaking with Laertes, and Laertes is Ophelia's brother. So this is the Queen says, "One woe doth tread upon another's heel, so fast they follow. Your sister's drowned, Laertes." And Laertes replies, "Drowned? Where?" And the Queen says, "There is a willow grows ascant the brook, that shows his hoary leaves in the glassy stream. Therewith fantastic garlands did she make, of crowed flowers, nettles, daisies, and long purples, that liberal shepherds give a grosser name, but our cuff-cold maids do dead men's fingers call them. There on the pendant boughs her crowned weeds, clamoring to hang, an envious sliver broke, when down her weedy trophies and herself fell in the weeping brook." And she ends up with, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lade to muddy death. So there's a description that holds quite a few references in the song See Emily Play. First off, she's sad. Well, not the reference to sadness, but the trees, the brook, and floating. And forever and ever could be a reference to death, which is forever and ever. One way of looking at it. Okay. Now, to establish the sadness of Ophelia, which is referenced in See Emily Play, we can tie that potentially to Act 4, Scene 5, when she's handing out things and her mind is disturbed with the fact that she may have lost Hamlet, or that, I believe this is after Hamlet accidentally killed her father. So Ophelia to Claudius, she says, "There's fennel for you," and Columbines to Gertrude, "There's rue for you, and here's some for me." So she gives herself rue, and there's a reason why we say rue the day, because it's a representation of regret and sadness. So in that statement there is a recognition of sadness. Now, that's all kind of tied together within See Emily Play. There's enough representation there of the aspects of Ophelia that I think you can now consider whether or not you think it was an influence upon Mr. Barrett for this song. Now, let's go ahead and tear apart this from another perspective, which would be from Hamlet's perspective. Okay, so it may simply just be that he's utilizing this wonderful piece of literature to inspire a song, to inspire a piece of artwork. But let's consider the third option, that this is actually a metaphor within a metaphor. So a double metaphor. And he may be relating a personal thing that's hidden within the story of Hamlet. And I would just like to point out that in painting, there are different kinds of painting, different methods of painting. So Andy Warhol, for example, can make paintings that are made for commercial sales. They are meant to be consumed by the general population. There also is abstract painting, and I've mentioned this before, but the vast majority of people don't enjoy abstract painting. In a way, in my opinion, abstract painting is made for artists. It is art made by artists for artists. And many times, only artists will really kind of get what's going on. There is some really trippy music out there, and you could argue that jazz is kind of like this. Jazz is kind of like music that's made for musicians, because you have to understand what regular music is supposed to sound like to thoroughly enjoy the twists of music that are being done within jazz. And so abstract painting is similar to that, and that's encapsulated with the idea of a metaphor within a metaphor that can only be enjoyed by some. Who those people may be, it's difficult to know. But I'm going to relay some aspects of this story now that may have been very interesting to Mr. Barrett and might explain why he chose to use this song, this story within his song. Now, the general outline of Hamlet is basically that you have the son of the King of Denmark, and he's in some undetermined relationship with Ophelia. Now, we find out through the story that they already have a kind of a relationship going, and that Hamlet's father dies or is murdered. And part of the whole argument of Hamlet is whether or not Hamlet is actually insane or not, whether he's stable or not, which also bears some kind of resemblance to Mr. Barrett's demeanor at certain points. And so Hamlet is kind of confronted with the idea of his mother marrying this new guy, and might be his uncle. I can't recall exactly. It's been a long time since I read Hamlet. But now Hamlet has to figure out a number of things, and we'll find out from the story that they had an existing relationship of some sorts, and it's kind of all thrown apart by the occurrences of this situation in his life, and he's trying to cope with that and establish himself, find some solid earth to stand on, to have stability in his life, and also figure his way forward. And anyway, that's just kind of some of the underlying ideas that are tied to the story itself. So the first thing that I want to point out is a quote. This is Act 1, Scene 2. The king, the new king, asks Hamlet, "How is it that the clouds still hang on you?" And he's talking to Hamlet, obviously. Hamlet says kind of, I don't know how you would say, kind of snidely, I don't know. "Not so, my lord, I am too much in the sun." Which is an odd statement to say. So the king's asking him, "Why is everything still so dark with you?" And Hamlet is saying, "No, I'm really happy I'm in the sun," which is again quite possibly similar to Mr. Barrett presenting, as we discussed before, a very happy face, which he may have felt obliged to do. The queen then, who is Hamlet's mother, says, "Good Hamlet, Cast thy nighted color off. Nighted meaning night, not night at nighttime, not night warrior. Cast thy nighted color off, and let thine eye look like a friend on Denmark. Do not forever with thy veiled lids seek for thy noble father in the dust. Thou knowest 'tis common, all that lives must die, passing through nature to eternity. So at some point in time, and we know that Syd's father died just before he turned 16, so he very likely would have either just read Hamlet, because that's around the time that most school kids do read it, or would read it shortly thereafter. And if he was paying attention, and I believe he would have been, he'll pick up on that immediately. And so he may have made a connection to the character of Hamlet. Now, as we said, it's difficult to know the exact relationship between the two of them, Ophelia and Hamlet, within the story, because it's not established before the story really gets going. So you have to kind of pick up on things midstream. And so I'd like to point out a few things. Ophelia is speaking with Laertes, her brother, as we already kind of pointed out. And this is before everything goes bad, so now I'm reading from forward to back. Laertes says to her, and he's getting ready to leave, he says, "My necessaries are embarked, farewell, and sister, as the winds give benefit, and convey as assistant, do not sleep, but let me hear from you." And Ophelia says, "Do you doubt that?" In other words, do you doubt that I'm going to be writing you? And Laertes says, "For Hamlet and the trifling of his favor, hold it a fashion and a toy in blood, a violet in the youth of primy nature, forward, not permanent, sweet, not lasting, the perfume and suppliance of a minute, no more." And she asks him, "No more but so." So her brother is advising her to be careful with Hamlet because of the whims of nature, and that favor can be a very trifling thing that is not lasting. So it's difficult, really, to know the nature of a person. So he's making an assumption based on his experience or his knowledge of himself or other men or etc. And many people do this. They tend to judge one another based on how they judge themselves, which sometimes isn't overly fair. Okay? We know already that Hamlet is being really disturbed by the death of his father, and the perceived lack of duty and honor of his mother to his father, which kind of shows a very deep connection to other people by Hamlet. And someone like that, and there's been a lot of psychological work on the nature of monogamy versus people that are not monogamous. And I'm not obviously a psychologist, but the things that I've read and seen seem to point to some people being kind of hardwired for monogamy and not everybody else is. So again, Shakespeare, he throws in, the guy's another genius, he throws in a lot of sub-ideas within his work. And here's one possibility, that Laertes is kind of judging the trustworthiness of a man who may be extremely trustworthy, and in fact much more trustworthy than he is himself. Okay, so Ophelia, let's move on now. Ophelia is talking with her father, a man named Polonius, and her father is kind of discussing the nature of Hamlet's relationship with her, and she says, "He hath, my lord, of late made many tenders of his affection to me." And Polonius, her father, says, "Affection, pah, you speak like a green girl, unsifted in such perilous circumstance. Do you believe his tenders, as you call them?" And she replies, "I do not know, my lord, what I should think." And Polonius says, "Mary, I will teach you. Think yourself a baby, that you have ta'en these tenders for true pay, which are not sterling." In other words, again, like her brother, her father is advising her that these are not necessarily set in stone, They're not married. And so Hamlet's words can't be taken or assumed to be forever, which, I mean, as a father and everything, I kind of get, but words have to be judged based on the character of the person that's involved. And in some ways, the character of the person isn't necessarily something that can ever totally be known. So people have to make assumptions about one another. Okay. Not long after that, this is in Act 2, Scene 1, the end of it. Polonius again is speaking with Ophelia, his daughter, and he says, "Come, go with me, I will go seek the king. This is the very ecstasy of love." Now he's assuming that Hamlet is entirely smitten with Ophelia, when in fact he's just completely disheveled because of things that have been happening in regard to his father's death, things that he's realizing. And leads the will to desperate undertakings, as oft as any passion under heaven, that does afflict our natures. I am sorry. What, have you given him any hard words of late? And Ophelia replies, "No, my good lord, but as you did command, I did repel his letters and denied his access to me." So right there, now there's a reference to denied letters and denied access to her, as was kind of directed by her father, which is an intervention. Later on in Act 2, Scene 2, Polonius is speaking with the queen about the queen's son, Hamlet, and he's showing her a letter from Hamlet to Ophelia. And the queen says, "Came this from Hamlet to her?" And Polonius says, "Good madam, stay a while, I will be faithful." He reads the letter. "Doubt thou the stars are fire, doubt that the sun doth move, doubt truth to be a liar, but never doubt I love." So this is a love letter, of course, to Ophelia. And at what point he wrote it to her, it's hard to say. But it is interesting in that it has a reference to the sun and the stars, and that that Hamlet's intentions are true. And in that way, perhaps, he is giving something within his words. If this is a person that is deeply committed and deeply motivated by sensations of emotional ties to other people, which we have an indication he is that type of person, then this would, for someone of that mindset, this would be akin to almost like a marriage proposal. Now later on, Hamlet kind of rebuffs Ophelia, as for some reason, this is in Act 3, Scene 1. He's talking with Ophelia, and this is where he kind of makes the famous statement, "Get thee to a nunnery," and he totally throws her off. And again, this kind of misunderstanding between the two lovers is quite possibly represented in the song "See Emily Play" by Ophelia trying, or Emily trying, but misunderstanding. So she's trying to understand the object of the song, but she's not really getting it. And that's happening here in this discussion. So, for example, Hamlet says, "Ha, ha, are you honest?" And she asks, "My lord?" And Hamlet says, "Are you fair?" And Ophelia says, "What means your lordship?" And Hamlet says that if you be honest and fair, your honesty should admit no discourse to your beauty. And Ophelia says, "Could beauty, my lord, have better commerce than with honesty?" So there's this whole discussion going on between these two that is absolutely confused, and she's trying to figure out his mind as he's going through the difficulties associated with trying to come to terms with his father's death and rectifying the situation. Now, later on, Hamlet accidentally kills her father, Polonius, and this kind of causes a spiral in Ophelia. She's losing pretty much everything, and at some point, the king, the new king, comes and speaks to her, and he says, "Pretty Ophelia." And Ophelia says, "Indeed, without an oath, I'll make an end on it. By Gis and by Saint Charity, alack, and fie for shame. Young men will do it if they come to it, so by cock they are to blame." Now, the reference to cock there is interesting because it's a double meaning, potentially a double meaning. After that, she says, "Quoth she, before you tumbled me, you promised me to wed." So now this opens another door, which is that it's possible that she's, and I don't know if this is an old song, I don't know the nature of this. She's quoting from something, so it may be a folk song of some type, or perhaps a poem. But the implication is, of course, that she has already been with Hamlet and that he's promised to marry her. And now all the things that have happened are really throwing her off. And of course, if they've already slept together, she may even be pregnant, which would be a representation to May, the games of May, or in other words, the games that people play of fertility. Follow? That are referenced, and that's referenced in See Emily Play, the song. And I think if you follow all that, then you have sufficient ties to realize that what Mr. Barrett may be doing is tying that story to his direct and personal life. Now, one of the things, and I'll finish with this, one of the things that people are going to want to ask is, who is Ophelia representing then? If it's a double metaphor and Hamlet represents Mr. Barrett, then who does Ophelia represent? And I have my suspicions, right? He doesn't state this, so there's really no way of knowing. And he doesn't ever call this person out by name. So I'm going to respect that because it's personal. That's personal for him and whoever this may have been. If there was even anyone that it represented, there's no way of knowing that. I would like to point, if you really want to know, and I'm not going to say that this is definite because I don't know, but there are certain coincidences that I'd like to point out, and these are from A Very Irregular Head by Rob Chapman again. All right? Now, one of the first things I'd like to point out is that at one point in time in the book, Mr. Chapman tells a story, and this is on page 372, of Syd Barrett bowing to someone. And I'm not going to say who it is, but I would like to point out that that is something that is done to royalty, which fits the nature of Hamlet and fits the king-queen relationship that we've already discussed. Okay? There also is a story on page 371 of Rosemary requesting someone to come visit Syd. And as far as I know, this is the only time. I have never heard of anyone else being requested to come visit him. And this is not long after Roger Barrett's mother had passed away. And the final thing I'd like to point out is that on page 357, there is a story of returning letters or returning diaries. Now, this is all post the song being made, mind you, okay? After Syd moved back to Cambridge to live at his mom's old place, these diaries and letters were returned to him. But I would like to suggest that this doesn't necessarily capture, this one instance doesn't necessarily capture the entirety of a discussion. So there may have already been cases of returned letters, okay? And that's something that can never be known, but it is something to think about. And there also is a story of a belief that perhaps their child belonged to Syd. But apparently, this person also states that Syd believed other people's children were his as well. So he may have simply had kind of a broken mind in a way. Now, interestingly, Mr. Rob Chapman points out a poet in the paragraph above that. And that poet's name is John Clare. And John Clare was an exceptional poet, and he was a very poor poet. He also had a form of, if we assume that there was an aspect of Mr. Barrett that was schizophrenic, John Clare certainly was committed, and he had, he's just a very interesting guy. Clare, C-L-A-R-E. And one of the things that he did was, at one of his most crazy points, crazy again not being a technical term, but at some point he believed that he was married to two separate women and that he had had children with a woman who had died many years before. Maybe that was his first true love. It's very difficult to say, but it appears that John Clare didn't have a full grasp on the flow of time, or that perhaps, who knows, maybe he was tuned into something else, or maybe he was just dreaming into reality things that he really, really wanted to be true, but that weren't. And it's hard to judge someone like that, in my opinion, because quite often people they'll recognize how things could have been, and it hurts a lot for them to deal with the way that things could have been with other people, or with potential families and potential children. And it's something that certain minds, certain people can't deal with. It's too much for them to consider the sadness that's tied to what could have been. And who knows, maybe that's kind of what's happening here, and Mr. Barrett's just kind of hoping that things maybe could have been a little bit different, but they weren't. And so he's doing the best he can with what he has. There is one last thing I'd like to discuss, and that is the nature of symbolism and color. And I've heard and read that people think that Syd may have had synesthesia, or a form of it, which is essentially people seeing color or hearing color, etc. I don't know if I necessarily, I think it's possible that people may actually see colors when they hear sounds, but I think most people will make connections symbolically that's tied to who they are. So for example, let's just take a color like blue, okay? Now the color blue can represent many, many, many different things. And obviously blue ties in with the water cycle. Water appears to be blue, so does the sky, and there's a water cycle between the sky and lakes and rivers and the ocean. So there's a cycle of blue that's happening. If you were to talk to a musician and mention blue, they're going to think, most of them will think of the blues. And that doesn't necessarily tie in with blues itself, with the color itself, but it's an association that's made by musicians. If you discuss the color blue with a painter, they're going to see blue as the absence of warmth, because warm colors are yellow, orange, red, variations thereof, and blue is opposite to orange on the color wheel. So most painters will represent, or they'll recognize blue as being a cold color. So there you have a whole bunch of different ways of interpreting something very, very simple, which is the color blue. And subconsciously, people will apply definitions or sensations to that color based on who they are. And a poet also may provide connections to the color blue based on poetry. So for example, blue and new. Someone, since they rhyme, someone might make a connection between the word new and blue. So blue things may be young things, etc. It's hard to say, really, based on who the person is. The thing I'd like to point out with Mr. Barrett is, again, in order to understand him, I feel you need to have some background in all these different things. It doesn't have to be an expert level of understanding of, let's say, painting, to understand the basics of painting that he's using in his songs. But if you have some idea of painting, poetry, and music, you can apply them synthetically to get a form of understanding that may be in line kind of with what he was trying to deliver. So there's 3 forms of CMLE play. You can kind of decide which one you think interpretation may be correct or not. Maybe they all are. Maybe they're tied together. Maybe they're not. And there is one last thing I'd like to point out in the name Emily. We previously discussed the importance of the first and the last letters in the discussion of Aleister Crowley. And in this case, the first letter is E and the last letter is Y. And if this is a reference to someone's name, you can utilize that together with a nickname of some sorts, and you can possibly figure out who the song might be about. And again, I'm not going to relay that information. He didn't state it. And if this is a personal metaphor, a personal double metaphor, I don't feel it's appropriate for me to kind of call that out. At any rate, that's all for CMLE Play. It's a very beautiful song, and in a way it's extremely touching, I think. It shows the depth of someone's persona and their soul, and perhaps a deep affection in spite of difficulties that are mutually experienced in life. And that's a pretty beautiful thing, in my opinion. If you are the kind of person that enjoys themes like this and literature from the past, I'll suggest that you may want to check out a link that I'll provide for Charles Kingsley's poem, Young and Old. And I will provide that in the description. And you can just look for my channel and then Young and Old, or any version of it really. It kind of captures this loss of innocence and that age of turning into the considerations of the past versus the future, and that kind of a feeling of upbeat sorrow, I guess, that comes with that age. And in the song that I made for that, I tried to capture that feeling with the video. So that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and if you haven't subscribed yet, then please share and subscribe with people that you think might be interested, and check out the video. If you like that, then I have some other songs that I've made for some short works of literature, and you might check those out as well. That's all for now, and I'll try to make another video tomorrow, perhaps. Talk to you later.